Welcome back to the Horror Shack. Tonight, we'll explore true horror stories for sleep that will keep you on the edge of your seat. But first, we would love you to comment where you're listening from and what time is it currently for you. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more spine-tingling episodes. Now let's get comfy. Story 1. Stalked by a strange bird. My name's Davin Mills, and I've always loved jogging in the evening. There's something about that time when the world slows down, and you feel like you're the only one out there. No honking cars, no bustling crowds, just you, the trees, and the faint hum of crickets waking up. My favorite spot was Fallow Ridge Park, this quiet little trail near my neighborhood. It's surrounded by dense trees, and during the day, you'd see squirrels darting around, maybe the occasional rabbit. Nothing out of the ordinary. I've been running that trail for months. Same loop, same route. I knew every bend, every patch of gravel, even which trees would creak when the wind hit just right. It wasn't a creepy place at all, or at least I never thought so. But the weirdest thing happened one evening, and I still can't get it out of my head. It started like any other jog. I laced up my sneakers, stretched a bit on my porch, and headed out just as the sky turned that soft, golden color. The air was cool, the kind of weather that makes running feel effortless. I remember thinking to myself how perfect everything felt. No work stress, no distractions, just me and the trail. About halfway through the loop, something strange caught my attention. I was jogging along this stretch where the trees form a kind of canopy overhead, blocking most of the fading sunlight. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, if that makes sense. Then I heard it, a faint sound like a soft thwip-thwip behind me. I slowed down and glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. No other joggers, no cyclists, nothing. Just the empty path stretching behind me. I figured it was probably a squirrel rustling in the leaves or a bird flapping its wings. You hear stuff like that all the time out there. But then it happened. Something brushed the back of my head. Not hard, but just enough to make me flinch. I whipped around so fast I nearly tripped over my own feet. And that's when I saw it. A bird. No, not just any bird. It was huge, way bigger than any bird I'd ever seen up close. Its wings spread wide as it glided silently over me, disappearing into the trees before I could fully process what just happened. I just stood there, heart pounding, staring into the dark patch of forest where it had vanished. What kind of bird does that? Was it hunting something? Did I get in its way? I told myself to relax. It was just a bird, probably startled by me running through its territory or something. Nothing to freak out about, right? So, I shook it off and kept jogging. But the whole time, I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder. Every little noise made my skin crawl, even though I knew it was ridiculous to feel that way. Would you keep going, or would you turn back? I kept telling myself it was nothing. Just a bird. Probably didn't even mean to brush me like that. But the way it moved, so quiet, so fast, I couldn't shake it. Still, I wasn't about to let some bird ruin my evening jog. I've never been the type to spook easily, and I wasn't going to start now. The next part of the trail was always my favorite. It curved around a small pond, the water still and smooth, reflecting the sky. Usually, I'd slow down a bit there, catch my breath, and take in the view. But this time, I kept up my pace. That's when I heard it again. Flip-flip. This time it was louder, closer. My first instinct was to stop and turn around, but something inside me screamed, "Don't stop. Just keep moving." So I did. I picked up my pace, my sneakers crunching against the gravel. The sound didn't go away. If anything, it followed me, matching my steps. I finally broke and glanced over my shoulder. At first, I didn't see anything, just the empty trail behind me, the shadows from the trees stretching across the path. But then there was, perched on a low-hanging branch, the bird. Its eyes were glowing, not in a supernatural way, like in a horror movie, but in that way animals' eyes sometimes reflect light at night. The thing is, there wasn't much light, just the faint glow of the evening sky. But its eyes, they cut through the dimness, locking onto me like I was prey. I froze for a moment, staring at it. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just sat there, watching me. I don't know how long we stood like that, but it felt like forever. Then, as if deciding it had seen enough, it spread its wings, massive, even bigger than I'd realized before, and launched itself toward me. I panicked. I mean, how do you prepare for something like that? I ducked, covering my head with my arms, and felt the air whoosh as it passed over me. Its claws didn't catch me, but I swear I could feel the breeze from its wings. When I looked up, it was gone again. I couldn't see where it went, but I wasn't about to stick around to find out. I started jogging again, this time faster. My heart was racing, not from the run, but from pure adrenaline. My usual calm, peaceful trail suddenly felt different. The trees seemed closer, the shadows darker. Every sound felt amplified. The crunch of leaves under my feet, the distant croak of a frog, the occasional snap of a branch. It wasn't until I reached the far side of the loop, the part closest to the park's entrance, that I started to feel a bit calmer. The lights from the nearby parking lot were visible through the trees, and the open space made me feel less trapped. I slowed down, trying to catch my breath, and that's when I heard it again. Flip, flip. This time it wasn't behind me. It was above me. I stopped and looked up, and there it was, circling overhead. The owl. It didn't dive this time, just hovered in a slow, steady loop, its eyes never leaving me. That's when I realized something. It wasn't just chasing me. It was stalking me. I froze, watching it circle. My chest felt tight, my breath shallow. I've seen birds hunt before, but this was different. It wasn't acting like a bird defending its nest or hunting prey. It was too deliberate, too focused. I couldn't shake the feeling that this thing had singled me out for a reason. But why? The glow of the parking lot lights wasn't far, just a few hundred feet. I told myself I'd be safe there. Birds don't follow people into bright, open spaces, right? I started walking briskly, keeping my eyes on the owl. My footsteps felt deafening on the gravel, each crunch echoing in my ears. The owl kept circling, its movements slow and methodical, like it was waiting for something. And then it stopped. One moment, it was gliding in smooth circles, and the next it perched on a branch just ahead of me. It was closer now, its head tilted slightly, those reflective eyes locked onto mine. I swear, I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. What was it waiting for? I didn't know what else to do, so I yelled at it. "Get out of here!" My voice sounded shaky, even to me. I grabbed a small rock from the trail and tossed it toward the tree. Not at the bird, just near it to scare it off. It didn't move. The rock hit the ground with a dull thud, but the owl stayed perfectly still. Its head turned slightly, like it was sizing me up. Then, without warning, it launched itself toward me again. I ducked, throwing my arms over my head, and stumbled backward. I could feel the rush of air as it passed over me, close enough that its feathers brushed my hair. I tripped, landing hard on the gravel, and scrambled to my feet as quickly as I could. That's when I noticed something else, its claws. They weren't empty. I didn't get a good look, but it seemed like the owl was holding something. A small, dark shape clutched tightly in its talons. It wasn't a branch or a piece of prey. It was something else, something I couldn't quite make out. My instincts were screaming at me to run, but I couldn't help staring at the spot where it had disappeared into the trees again. I stood there for what felt like ages, my whole body trembling. The shadows around me felt alive, every rustle of leaves setting me on edge. What had it been holding? Was it just my imagination? I forced myself to move, walking quickly toward the parking lot lights. The trail felt longer than it ever had before, the trees pressing in on either side. Every time I thought I was in the clear, I'd hear that faint thwip-thwip behind me, and my heart would leap into my throat. Finally, I reached the edge of the park, where the gravel met the asphalt. The parking lot was empty except for my car, its silhouette faintly illuminated by the overhead lights. I practically sprinted to it, fumbling with my keys as I kept glancing over my shoulder. As I unlocked the door, I heard it again, the thwip-thwip, closer this time. I jumped into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut, locking it instantly. My hands were shaking so badly that it took me a couple of tries to get the key into the ignition. When the engine roared to life, I felt a wave of relief, but it was short-lived. I looked out the windshield, and there was... The owl was perched on a lamppost at the edge of the lot, its glowing eyes fixed on me. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I threw the car into reverse, my tires screeching as I backed out of the lot and sped away. My heart didn't stop pounding until I was halfway home. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing eyes staring back at me. I kept thinking about the way it had followed me, the way it seemed to know exactly where I was going. And that thing it was carrying, what was it? I didn't go back to Fallow Ridge Park after that. Even now, I avoid it, taking a different route for my evening runs. I still don't know what really happened that night. Was it just a bird being territorial? Or was there something else going on? Something I can't explain? All I know is that I wasn't imagining it. I've never felt so certain of anything in my life. So, if you're ever out on a trail at dusk, and you hear a faint thwip-thwip behind you, don't look back. Just keep running. For days after the incident, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Even at home, where I should have felt safe, I'd catch myself glancing at the windows, half expecting to see those glowing eyes staring back at me. My sleep was restless, full of strange dreams where I was back on the trail, running endlessly but never getting away. I told myself it was just paranoia. That's what people do after a scare, right? They jump at shadows. But the unease didn't go away. One night, I woke up suddenly, my heart pounding. At first, I didn't know what had startled me, but then I heard it, a faint thump against the window. I sat up, straining to listen. It came again, louder this time. Thump. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help myself. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window, the moonlight casting long shadows across my bedroom. There was nothing there. I let out a shaky breath, feeling silly. Maybe a branch was brushing against the glass, or maybe it was just my imagination. I was about to lie back down when I noticed something on the windowsill. A feather. Not just any feather. It was large and dark, unmistakably from the owl. My stomach dropped. How could it have gotten there? My bedroom was on the second floor. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I tried to brush it off, telling myself it must have been blown there by the wind. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The timing was too perfect, too deliberate. As the week went on, the strange occurrences kept piling up. I'd hear the faint thwip-thwip sound when I was out running errands, even in broad daylight. Once, I found another feather tucked under my windshield wiper. And then there were the shadows, those fleeting, bird-like shapes I'd catch in the corner of my vision, only to find nothing when I turned around. I started to wonder if I was losing my mind. One evening, about a week after the incident at the park, I decided to do something I'd been avoiding. Go back to Fallow Ridge. I thought maybe if I faced it head-on, I could put the whole thing behind me. The park felt different this time. The air was heavy, the kind of oppressive silence that makes you hyper-aware of every sound. The usual chirping of crickets and rustling of leaves was absent, replaced by an eerie stillness. I walked cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The trail looked the same as always, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As I rounded the bend where the first encounter had happened, I stopped in my tracks. There in the middle of the path was a small pile of rocks. On top of the pile sat a single, dark feather. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely think. I felt like I was being dared to come closer, but every instinct screamed at me to turn around and leave. Against my better judgment, I stepped forward, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I got closer, I noticed something else, scratches in the dirt like claw marks, leading away from the pile and into the trees. I followed them. I don't know what possessed me to keep going. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the desperate need to prove to myself that there was a rational explanation for all of this. The trail of scratches led me deeper into the woods, where the trees grew thicker and the darkness seemed almost alive. The air smelled damp and earthy, and I could hear the faint rustling of leaves overhead. And then I saw it. Perched on a low branch, just ahead of me, was the owl. Its eyes reflected the beam of my flashlight, glowing like tiny lanterns in the night. But there was something off about it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't alone. Below it, scattered among the roots of the tree, were more feathers. And something else, small objects glinting faintly in the light. As I got closer, I realized they were trinkets. A broken keychain, a watch, a child's toy. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. What was this? A nest? A collection? And why did some of the objects look fresh? The owl let out a low, guttural sound, not quite a hoot, and spread its wings. I stepped back instinctively, my flashlight shaking. It didn't fly at me this time, but it didn't need to. The message was clear. I wasn't welcome here. I turned and ran, branches snagging at my clothes as I tore through the woods. The path blurred beneath my feet, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist around me. I didn't stop until I burst into the parking lot, gasping for air. I never went back to Fallow Ridge Park after that. To this day, I don't know what that owl wanted or why it seemed to target me. Was it just an animal being territorial, or was there something more to it? Something I don't have the words to explain? Story 2. Saved by a Turn. Darnell wasn't the type to scare easily. Back in his early 20s, he lived in a rough part of town where things like petty theft, fights, and even worse weren't exactly uncommon. Everyone in the neighborhood knew to stay on their toes, especially late at night. My uncle worked the night shift back then, so being out at odd hours wasn't unusual for him. It happened on one of those cold, quiet nights when the air feels heavier than usual, and every sound seems louder. You know the kind of night I'm talking about, when even the wind feels like it's carrying secrets. Darnell had just finished a long shift at the factory, and all he wanted to do was call home and let his mom know he'd be back soon. They didn't have cell phones back then, at least not ones you'd find in a neighborhood like his. If you needed to make a call, you had to find a payphone, and payphones weren't exactly the safest spots to hang out, but sometimes you didn't have a choice. That night, he stopped at one of the few payphones in the area. It was on the corner of an old convenience store that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 70s. The neon sign above the shop flickered on and off like it was trying to hold on to life. The street was almost empty, except for a parked car a little ways down and the occasional shadow moving behind a curtain in one of the apartment windows. As Darnell approached the payphone, he kept his head on a swivel. Not in an obvious way, but enough to know what was going on around him. He always said, in that neighborhood, you don't ever assume you're alone, even when it looks like you are. He reached in his pocket, pulling out some loose coins. The clinking sound of metal was almost too loud in the stillness. He picked up the receiver, fed the machine, and started dialing. The phone crackled to life, and for a second, he let himself relax. But then, something felt off. Have you ever had that feeling? Like your body knows something isn't right before your brain catches up? He couldn't explain it, but there was this sense, like the air had changed, and he wasn't as alone as he thought. He tried to shake it off and focus on his call. Maybe he was just being paranoid. It wouldn't have been the first time, but as he waited for the call to connect, he caught movement in his peripheral vision. A car, slowly rolling up the street. What would you have done? Would you have ignored it? Pretended not to notice? That's what he was tempted to do. But something, he still doesn't know what, made him glance over his shoulder. It was an old, beat-up sedan, its headlights dim like they didn't want to draw attention. The car rolled to a stop, maybe 10 feet behind him. The passenger window slid down, and that's when he saw it. A figure in the passenger seat. Dark clothes, hood pulled low, and then the gleam of metal. A shotgun. Darnell froze. For a second, it was like the world had gone completely still. No wind, no sounds, nothing. Just him, the payphone, and the car behind him. His brain raced to make sense of what was happening. Was this real? Was he imagining it? But there was no mistaking it. The barrel of the shotgun caught a faint glint from the flickering neon light above the store, and it was aimed right at him. What would you do in that moment? Run? Freeze? Pretend you didn't notice? Darnell told me later that his instincts kicked in before his thoughts could. He turned slowly, still holding the receiver to his ear like he was just some guy making a phone call, like nothing was out of the ordinary. But his body was tense, every muscle bracing for what might come next. The man in the passenger seat didn't say a word at first. His face was hard to make out in the shadow of the car's interior, but Darnell could feel the weight of his gaze. It wasn't casual. It was focused, like he was sizing him up, trying to decide something. Darnell's heart was pounding so hard he swore they could hear it. He could feel sweat trickling down his back, even though the night was cold. He kept his movements slow, deliberate, not wanting to spook them. Then, the man finally spoke. "It's not him," he said, his voice low and gruff. Darnell didn't dare breathe. He locked eyes with the guy for what felt like forever, trying to gauge if he was really about to lower that weapon, or if he decided to pull the trigger anyway. The driver leaned over, his face barely visible. He muttered something Darnell couldn't hear, and then, just like that, the shotgun was pulled back inside the car. The passenger turned to the driver and nodded. "Let's go." The car didn't speed off right away. It rolled forward slowly, almost lazily, as if they wanted to make sure Darnell wouldn't suddenly do something stupid, like run or call for help. He stayed perfectly still until the car disappeared around the corner. Then, and only then, did he let out the breath he'd been holding. His legs felt like jelly, and he had to lean against the payphone just to keep himself upright. But he didn't leave right away. That sense of unease was still there, stronger now. What if they came back? What if they'd changed their minds? What if they realized whoever they were looking for wasn't nearby and decided he'd be a good stand-in? Darnell didn't go home right away. He ducked into the convenience store, which thankfully was still open, and waited there for a while. The clerk gave him a strange look, probably wondering why this guy was just standing by the snack aisle, not buying anything. But Darnell didn't care. He just wanted to be somewhere with other people around, even if it was just one other person. When he finally felt it was safe enough, he made his way home, but not without constantly checking over his shoulder. Every sound made him jump, the rustle of leaves, a distant dog barking, even his own footsteps. When he got home, he didn't tell anyone right away. Not his mom, not his friends, nobody. It wasn't until weeks later, when the neighborhood was buzzing about a gang shooting that had happened just a few blocks from that same corner, that he pieced it all together. Apparently, there had been some kind of turf war brewing for a while. Two gangs, each trying to take control of the area, and things had escalated to the point where hit jobs were being ordered. The guy they were looking for that night wasn't just anyone. He was someone who'd crossed the wrong people in a big way. Darnell had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The description of the guy they were after must have been close enough to him to make those men stop and take a second look. If he hadn't turned around, if he hadn't made eye contact, they might have just assumed he was their target and pulled the trigger. Even now, Darnell says he can still see that shotgun in his mind like it happened yesterday. The cold metal, the way it gleamed under the flickering light, the way the man's finger hovered over the trigger. He doesn't like to think about what would have happened if things had gone differently. If the driver had been less cautious, if the passenger had been more certain, if Darnell had reacted the wrong way. But what really gets to him, he says, is how close he came to being a name in the local news. Just another victim of gang violence, another statistic in a neighborhood that already had too many. Darnell told me this story as a warning, to be aware of your surroundings, to trust your gut even when it doesn't make sense, because sometimes it's the little things like turning around at just the right moment that can save your life. Are you currently enjoying the story? Go ahead and pause for a sec. Hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. It really helps me get feedback. Thanks, and now let's continue the story. Story 3. The Night Nurse. You know how people say hospitals are supposed to be places of healing? That they're where you go to get better, to feel safe? I used to think that too, until I started hearing about Victor Halloran. It's weird because, at first glance, he seemed like the kind of guy you want taking care of you. People said he was quiet, polite, and always willing to help. He never caused drama, never stepped out of line. If anything, he just kind of blended in like wallpaper. But maybe that's what made him so dangerous. Victor wasn't like the other nurses. Sure, he had the same uniform, the same tools, the same training. But there was something about him, something no one could put their finger on until it was too late. Have you ever looked back on a situation and thought, why didn't anyone stop him? How did this go on for so long? That's what everyone asks now, looking back at what he did. And honestly, it's a question I still don't have an answer for. The first time I heard about Victor was from an old coworker who worked at a hospital in New Jersey back in the 90s. She told me about this nurse who always seemed to be around when something went wrong. Patients who were stable would suddenly crash in the middle of the night. Machines that were fine during the day would start beeping like crazy when Victor was on shift. She said they used to joke that he was cursed, that bad luck followed him around. But then, one night, a patient who had just been talking to her family an hour earlier was found unresponsive. The doctors couldn't figure it out. There was no medical explanation. And Victor? He was the last person who had been in the room. At the time, nobody thought much of it. Nurses see a lot of death. It's part of the job. But then it happened again. And again. At first, the staff brushed it off as coincidence. Hospitals are chaotic places, and people die unexpectedly all the time. But the weird thing was, these weren't patients who were supposed to die. Most of them were stable, even improving, and then, just like that, they were gone. I remember asking my coworker, did anyone report it? Say anything to management? She shook her head and said something that stuck with me ever since. You don't question a nurse like Victor. He was too quiet. Too quiet. What does that even mean? She tried to explain, but the more I think about it, the more I get it now. Victor didn't make waves. He didn't argue with anyone, didn't gossip, didn't even hang around in the break room. He just came in, did his job, and left. That's what made him so invisible. And, as it turns out, so dangerous. The hospital didn't catch on right away, but the other nurses did. They started noticing things, like how Victor always volunteered for the night shifts, how he seemed to linger in supply rooms longer than he needed to, and how, when a patient crashed, he was somehow always one of the first people there, almost like he was waiting for it to happen. Do you think he was doing something? I asked her. She hesitated, then nodded. I didn't want to believe it, but yeah, I think he was. It wasn't just her either. Over the years, Victor worked at 12 different hospitals. 12. And everywhere he went, the same thing happened. Patients dying in strange, unexplainable ways. Nurses whispering about him in the halls. Managers quietly asking him to leave without making a fuss. He never stayed in one place for too long, which probably helped him get away with it for so long. Back then, hospitals didn't always share records the way they do now. If you were a nurse with experience, you could pretty much walk into any hospital and get a job. and Victor had plenty of experience. It makes me wonder, how many times did someone see something and just look the other way? One story she told me still gives me chills. There was a patient, an elderly man recovering from surgery. He wasn't in great shape, but he was stable. The night Victor was assigned to him, the man's daughter stayed late, sitting by his bedside. She said Victor came in to check on him, adjusted his four, and left without a word. A few hours later, the machine started beeping. The daughter called for help, but by the time the doctors got there, it was too late. The man had gone into cardiac arrest. The daughter was hysterical, screaming that something wasn't right. She swore up and down that the nurse, Victor, had done something to her father's four. But the hospital said there was no evidence of foul play. They brushed her off as a grieving family member looking for someone to blame. Victor kept his job for another 6 months after that. It wasn't until years later, after he had moved on to another hospital, that people started connecting the dots. The pattern was too obvious to ignore. Dozens of deaths, all with no clear cause. And always, Victor was there. One nurse even tried to report him to the state board, but nothing came of it. She told me it was like trying to fight a ghost. No one wanted to listen, and no one wanted to take responsibility. Why do you think he did it? I asked her once. She shrugged. I don't know. Maybe he liked the control. Or maybe he just liked watching people die. It wasn't until 2008 that Victor was finally caught, and even then, it was almost by accident. An anonymous tip led investigators to look into a string of suspicious deaths at his last hospital. When they pulled his records, they found that he had worked at 10 other facilities with similar cases. They started digging and found dozens of cases that didn't add up. In some, patients had been given medications they weren't prescribed. In others, fatal doses of drugs were found in 4 bags that had been tampered with. And in every case, Victor had been on duty. When the police finally arrested him, they found notebooks in his apartment detailing some of the deaths. He had written down the dates, times, and even the drugs he had used. Victor confessed to 50 murders, but investigators believe the real number is closer to 300. Maybe more. Here's the part that still haunts me. No one knows why he did it. He never gave a clear motive. Some people think he was experimenting, trying to play God. Others think he just got a sick thrill out of it. And the scariest thing? Victor Halloran wasn't some monster hiding in the shadows. He was just a quiet, unassuming nurse. The kind of person you'd never look twice at. When Victor was arrested, it wasn't a dramatic scene like you'd see in the movies. No sirens blaring, no standoff. The police showed up at his modest apartment one morning, knocked on the door, and he answered like nothing was wrong. They said he even smiled at them, as if he'd been expecting it. They found him sitting at a small table with a half-empty cup of coffee and a notebook open in front of him. He didn't try to hide the notebook. In fact, he slid it toward the officers without being asked. Inside were pages and pages of names, dates, and cryptic notes. Some entries just had a first name and a date. Others included bizarre details, like blue 4 bag, 3rd drawer, or 11:47 p.m., 2nd round. When they asked him what it all meant, he simply said, "You'll figure it out." The investigators didn't figure it out right away, though. They spent months combing through hospital records, trying to match the names in the notebook to real patients. The problem was, not all the names matched. Some were nicknames, others were initials, and a few seemed completely random. And then there were the gaps. Weeks, sometimes months, where there were no entries at all. Those were the times when Victor had been fired or had taken a break between jobs. But as soon as he landed at a new hospital, the entries started up again. One detective said it was like playing a sick game of connect the dots, except the dots were people's lives. Victor's co-workers were interviewed, and the stories they told were chilling. One nurse remembered walking into the supply room late one night and finding Victor standing there, staring at a shelf of 4 bags. She said he didn't even look at her when she asked what he was doing. He just muttered something about checking inventory and walked out. Another nurse said she had caught him hovering by a patient's bedside long after he was supposed to have finished his rounds. When she asked why he was there, he claimed he was double-checking their vitals. But the patient, an elderly woman recovering from a routine surgery, died an hour later. Then there was the janitor who swore he saw Victor pouring something into a trash can full of used syringes. He didn't think much of it at the time, just assumed Victor was disposing of expired meds. But now, he wasn't so sure. As the investigation continued, the media got wind of the story, and the headlines were everywhere. Nurse or nightmare? The dark secrets of Victor Halloran. Death in the night. The case of the killer caregiver. People couldn't get enough of it. Talk shows, documentaries, podcasts. They all wanted to know the same thing. How did this happen? How did a man like Victor Halloran go undetected for so long? How did he manage to move from hospital to hospital without raising more alarms? And most importantly, how many lives did he really take? When Victor finally went to trial, the courtroom was packed. Family members of his alleged victims filled the seats, clutching photos of their loved ones. Some were crying. Others just sat there, staring at him with this look of pure hatred. Victor, for his part, seemed completely unfazed. He sat there with this blank expression on his face, like he was bored or tired. The prosecution laid out their case, detailing how Victor had used his position to access medications and tamper with 4 bags. They presented testimony from medical experts who explained how the drugs he used could cause sudden, unexplained deaths. But the most damning evidence was Victor's own notebook. Page after page of meticulously recorded details, all pointing to a man who had turned his job into a twisted game. When it was his turn to speak, Victor didn't apologize. He didn't try to explain himself or plead for mercy. Instead, he said something that sent chills down everyone's spine. "I did what I had to do," he said. "Some people don't deserve to live." That was it. No elaboration, no emotion. Just those 7 words. Victor was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even now, years later, questions still linger. Who were the people in his notebook whose names didn't match any records? Were they real victims? Or was Victor just trying to mess with the investigators? And what about the hospitals? How much did they know? Some of them claimed they had no idea what was going on, but others admitted to firing Victor after multiple complaints. Complaints about what, exactly? They wouldn't say. To this day, many of Victor's alleged victims remain unidentified. Families who lost loved ones to unexplained deaths are left wondering. Was it him? Was Victor Halloran the reason my mother, my father, my child didn't come home? The scariest part? Victor wasn't the first nurse to abuse their position like this, and he probably won't be the last. It makes you think twice about trusting someone just because they wear a uniform, doesn't it? And the hospitals? Well, they've all promised to do better, to be more vigilant, to put patient safety first. But promises like that are easy to make when the damage is already done. So the next time you're in a hospital, lying there in the dark with nothing but the hum of machines to keep you company, ask yourself, who's really watching over me? And are they here to help or to harm? Story 4. Midnight Knock. Late one night, while I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone, my screen lit up with a call from Rachel. Rachel never called me that late. We were close, sure, but if anything, she would have just sent a text. So, when I saw her name pop up, I felt something wasn't right. When I answered, I could barely understand her. She was crying and talking so fast that her words blurred together. I remember the first thing I caught was, "Please, come over." That was enough to make me sit up straight. Then she said, "Someone's hurt. It's bad." I didn't even ask questions. Her voice shook so much it scared me. Whatever was happening, I knew it was serious. I threw on a hoodie, grabbed my keys, and got in my car. I kept thinking about what Rachel said. It's bad. What could she mean? Was it her? Her family? I felt like calling her back, but I was scared I'd distract her or make things worse somehow. Her house was only about 10 minutes away, but those 10 minutes felt endless. I tried to stay calm, but my brain wouldn't stop racing. Did someone get hurt in an accident? Did someone try to rob her? My heart was pounding as I turned into her street. Rachel's neighborhood was usually so quiet at night that it felt like stepping into another world. You could hear the wind in the trees or the occasional bark from a dog. But tonight it felt different. It was still quiet, but there was something heavier about it. I could see Rachel's house at the end of the street, and my headlights caught something unusual. There were people standing in her driveway. I recognized Rachel right away. She was holding on to someone I didn't recognize, a woman. The woman looked like she could barely stand, and Rachel was gripping her arms like she was trying to keep her from collapsing. I pulled up, and Rachel ran to my car. "Thank God you're here," she said, her voice shaking. I didn't know who else to call. "What happened?" I asked, getting out of the car. But before she could answer, my attention shifted to the woman she'd been holding on to. She was trembling, and her face had blood on it. Her clothes were torn, her hair a mess. I froze for a second because I didn't know what to do. Rachel had to grab my arm to snap me out of it. "She's my neighbor. She was attacked," Rachel said, her words coming out in gasps. "I don't know who did it, but they're still out there." Hearing that felt like a slap to the face. "Someone out there?" My eyes darted around the street, but it was so dark that I couldn't see much. The only light came from the porch lamps and my car's headlights. "Let's get inside," I said, glancing around again. My voice didn't sound steady, but I tried to act calm for Rachel's sake. I helped her guide the woman into the house, and once we got inside, Rachel locked the door behind us. "Did you call the police?" I asked. "They're on their way," Rachel said, pacing back and forth. But I didn't know what to do. She showed up banging on my door, screaming for help. I didn't even know it was her at first. The woman, Rachel's neighbor, was sitting on the couch now, holding a blanket Rachel must have given her. She hadn't said a word. Her hands were shaking as she clutched the blanket, and her eyes kept darting toward the windows like she was afraid someone might be watching. "What happened to her?" I whispered to Rachel, trying not to let the woman hear. Rachel just shook her head. "She hasn't told me much, just that someone broke into her house." Before I could respond, the woman suddenly spoke. Her voice was low and shaky. "He had a mask. He didn't say anything. Just started hitting me." Hearing that made my stomach drop. Rachel sat beside her and tried to comfort her, but the woman flinched when Rachel touched her shoulder. I stood there, feeling useless, trying to process what she'd just said. A man in a mask, attacking her in her own home, and he could still be out there? I had so many questions, but I didn't want to push her. Instead, I asked Rachel quietly, "Where's her house?" Rachel hesitated before pointing out the window. "2 doors down," she said. "The lights are still on." I looked out, and sure enough, her house stood out on the otherwise dark street. The front door was wide open, which sent a chill down my spine. Someone had clearly forced their way in. The frame looked busted. "Should we?" I started to say, but Rachel cut me off. "No, we wait for the cops," she said firmly. "I'm not going over there." She was right, of course, but something about just sitting there, waiting, felt wrong. The woman on the couch was whispering something now, but I couldn't make it out. Rachel leaned in closer to listen, and I stayed by the window, keeping an eye on the street. Every little noise outside made me jump. A rustle of leaves, the creak of a branch. I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that whoever did this might still be out there. Then, out of nowhere, there was a loud bang on the front door. We all froze. Rachel's neighbor let out a muffled scream and pulled the blanket tighter around herself. Rachel ran to the door but stopped a few feet away, her hands trembling as they hovered near the lock. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice breaking. There was no answer. I moved toward the door, my legs feeling like lead. "Maybe it's the police," I said, though I didn't really believe it. Something about the knock felt wrong. Too loud, too sudden. I looked through the peephole, but saw nothing but darkness. No flashing lights, no shadow of a figure. Just the empty porch. "There's no one there," I whispered to Rachel. She didn't move, didn't say a word. The neighbor on the couch was crying now, quietly but uncontrollably, her shoulders shaking as she tried to stay silent. Then it happened again. Bang! This time, it came from the side of the house. We all jumped, and Rachel grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "What the hell is going on?" she whispered. I looked toward the window, but the blinds were drawn. I wanted to pull them back, to look, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My mind was racing. What if it was the guy? What if he came back? "Did you lock the back door?" I asked Rachel, my voice barely a whisper. Her eyes went wide. "I think so," she said, but the way she said it didn't reassure me. "I'll check," I said, though every part of me was screaming not to. I walked slowly toward the kitchen, where the back door was, and I swear, every creak of the floor sounded like a gunshot. I felt like someone was watching me, even though I couldn't see anything. When I reached the door, I saw that it wasn't locked. It was shut, but the bolt wasn't turned. My hands were shaking so badly, it took me 2 tries to lock it. I stood there for a moment, staring at the door, listening. The house was eerily silent now. No more banging, no footsteps, nothing. But then I heard it, a faint scraping sound like metal against glass. My heart dropped. It was coming from the living room. I ran back to find Rachel and her neighbor huddled on the couch. Rachel was staring at the window, her face pale. "The window," she whispered. "He's at the window." I turned to look, and for a split second, I saw a shadow move past the blinds. It was so quick I almost thought I imagined it. But the way Rachel's neighbor started sobbing told me I hadn't. "We need to get out of here," I said. "Now." Rachel shook her head. "The cops are on their way. If we go outside, if we stay in here, we're trapped." I snapped. I didn't mean to yell, but my fear was getting the better of me. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. It had been at least 20 minutes since Rachel called the police. Where the hell were they? Before we could argue more, there was another noise, a loud crash from the direction of the neighbor's house. It sounded like glass shattering. Whatever fear I had about going outside was suddenly outweighed by the thought of staying in this house another second. "Come on," I said, grabbing Rachel's hand. "We're going to my car." She hesitated, but the sound of another bang, this one much closer, convinced her. Rachel helped her neighbor to her feet, and we moved toward the door as quietly as we could. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. When we opened the door, the cold night air hit me like a slap. The street was still empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. We hurried to my car, and just as we got inside, I saw something, or someone, step out from behind Rachel's house. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a black hoodie. He was standing completely still, just watching us. "Go!" Rachel screamed, and I didn't need to be told twice. I slammed on the gas and sped down the street, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they hurt. In the rearview mirror, I saw the man step back into the shadows. Then he was gone. We didn't stop driving until we saw the flashing lights of a police car heading toward Rachel Street. Even then, I didn't feel safe. None of us did. Rachel's neighbor was taken to the hospital, and the police searched the area, but they didn't find anyone. The attacker was never caught or identified. Rachel's family moved a few months later, and I never drove through that neighborhood again. The memory of that night, the shadow at the window, the man in the street, still haunts me. I don't think I'll ever forget it. As much as I wanted to forget that night, it never truly let me go. For weeks, maybe months after it happened, I couldn't sleep properly. Every little noise in the dark would send my mind spiraling back to Rachel's house, to the shadow at the window and the man stepping out from behind the house. I started double-checking my locks at night, then triple-checking. I even put a chair against my bedroom door. Not that it helped me feel any safer. I thought Rachel and I would talk about it more afterward, but we didn't. We texted a bit in the days following, but she was distant. I think she was dealing with her own trauma, trying to move on in her own way. Her family sold the house quickly, and she left the neighborhood without much of a goodbye. I didn't blame her. Honestly, I envied her for being able to leave it behind so cleanly. For me, the whole thing felt like a splinter I couldn't dig out. Always there, always festering. One night, about 3 weeks after it happened, I woke up to a loud noise. It wasn't just a random creak or thump. It was loud enough to shake me out of a deep sleep. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. For a moment, I thought it was all in my head, a leftover echo of that night at Rachel's. But then I heard it again. It was coming from outside. I got out of bed and crept to the window, barely breathing. My street was dark, as usual, and nothing looked out of place at first. But then I saw something near the end of the block, a figure walking slowly down the sidewalk. I couldn't make out much in the dim light, but it was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes. For a second, I thought I was imagining it. It couldn't be him, right? It was probably just a random guy, taking a walk late at night. But then he stopped, right in front of my neighbor's house, and he just stood there. I couldn't see his face, but I could tell he was looking at the house. He didn't move, didn't knock, didn't do anything. Just stood there, staring. My neighbor, Mr. Andrews, was an older man who lived alone. His lights were off, and I wondered if he was even awake. Should I call him? Should I call the police? I didn't know what to do. Then, as suddenly as he'd stopped, the man turned and started walking again. This time, he was heading toward my house. I ducked down below the window, my heart pounding so hard I thought he might hear it. What was he doing? Was he just some random guy? Or was this him? The man who attacked Rachel's neighbor? The thought made my stomach churn. I stayed there, crouched by the window, listening. I heard his footsteps on the sidewalk, slow and deliberate. They stopped when they reached my driveway. Then nothing. Silence. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe. And then came the knock. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp. A single, deliberate knock on my front door. I froze, my mind racing. Should I answer it? Pretend I wasn't home? Call the cops? I couldn't bring myself to move. Another knock. This one was louder, more insistent. I crawled across the floor to my phone, trying to keep as quiet as possible. My hands were shaking as I dialed 911. The operator answered, and I whispered into the phone, explaining what was happening. They assured me an officer was on the way, but it felt like forever. The knocks kept coming, each one louder than the last. It was like he knew I was inside, like he was daring me to open the door. I thought about shouting through the door, telling him to go away, but I was too scared. What if it just made him angrier? Then, as suddenly as they started, the knock stopped. The silence was almost worse. I sat there, clutching my phone, straining to hear anything. Footsteps, breathing, anything at all. But there was nothing. It was like he'd vanished. The police showed up about 10 minutes later. They searched the area, but didn't find anyone. I felt like an idiot trying to explain what had happened. He was knocking, and then he was gone. I told them. They probably thought I was imagining things, jumping at shadows. But I knew what I'd seen and heard. After they left, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up all night, pacing the house, checking the locks, looking out the windows. I felt like a prisoner in my own home. Over the next few days, I kept seeing things, shadows in the corner of my eye, figures in the distance. Every time I left the house, I felt like I was being watched. I told myself it was just paranoia, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. Then, one night, I got a text from an unknown number. It was a single word, "Why?" I stared at my phone, my blood running cold. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew it wasn't random. My hands were shaking as I typed back, "Who is this?" But there was no reply. That was when I realized this wasn't over. Not even close. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me, waiting for me to slip up. Every little sound sent me into a panic. I started double-checking the locks again, the blinds, the windows, and the doors. No matter how many times I did it, though, the fear was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. For the next few weeks, the texts continued. Each one was the same "why?" followed by silence. I tried to ignore them, but it was impossible. The dread of not knowing who was sending them gnawed at me. It felt like a taunt, like someone was trying to break me down, bit by bit. I started to wonder if the man, the one who had attacked Rachel's neighbor, the one who had knocked on my door that night, had never really left. Maybe he'd been watching me too. Maybe he was just waiting for the right moment. One night it got worse. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard a knock on my door. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to remember if I'd locked everything up before going to bed. I hadn't been paying much attention earlier, too tired and too overwhelmed by the paranoia that had taken over my life. But now it didn't matter. The knock came again, louder this time. It was unmistakable. Someone was at the door. I told myself it was just a neighbor, maybe someone who needed help. But I knew deep down that wasn't true. I was in the same house, on the same street, with the same man, whoever he was stalking me. I didn't want to answer, but I felt like I had no choice. I had to know who it was. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold the phone. The operator answered quickly, her calm voice the only thing grounding me in the moment. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone at my door, I whispered. I don't know who they are, but I think he's coming after me. The operator assured me help was on the way, but it felt like hours passed before I heard sirens outside. The knocks didn't stop though. Each one was louder than the last, as if the person knew I was inside and was growing more impatient. I was terrified. I couldn't keep my eyes off the door. I didn't dare move from my spot by the window, watching the faint shadow of someone just outside. I didn't know what they wanted or why they were targeting me, but I knew I wasn't safe. The door handle rattled. My breath caught in my throat. Then the door creaked open. I didn't know how or why, but the door had somehow unlocked on its own. It swung open slowly, revealing the figure standing there. But it wasn't just one person. There were two. Both men, both in dark clothing. The man who had been stalking Rachel's house, and another man I'd never seen before. I could only make out their shapes in the dim light from the street lamp, but I could feel the cold, menacing aura radiating off them. My mind went blank for a moment, and I didn't know what to do. Fight or flight, but I was frozen in place, watching them step closer. The first man stepped into the entryway, his dark eyes gleaming in the shadows. "You shouldn't have ignored us," he said, his voice low and smooth. The second man didn't speak, but I could see a knife glinting in his hand, and the fear in my stomach grew heavier. "Why are you doing this?" I asked, my voice trembling. I had to get them to leave. I had to stall, to keep them talking. "You should have stayed away," the first man said, a twisted smile forming on his lips. "You're just like the others. You think you're safe, but you're not." I didn't understand. My heart pounded in my chest. "What do you want? What do you mean, the others?" The second man took a step forward, raising the knife. "You didn't learn your lesson the first time," he growled, his voice rough. "We don't forget." I backed away slowly, my mind racing. What was happening? Had they been watching me all this time? Was I their next victim? The second man lunged forward, but before I could react, there was a loud crash from outside. The men froze, their eyes darting toward the window. The sound of screeching tires echoed in the distance, followed by the sudden arrival of flashing police lights. The first man cursed under his breath and turned to flee, dragging the second man with him. I stood there, paralyzed, as they disappeared into the night. swallowed by the darkness. I rushed to the door, slamming it shut behind me. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely lock it. I didn't know how they had gotten inside, or what had happened in the moments before the police arrived, but I wasn't about to ask questions. The officers were at the door within seconds. I let them in, and they immediately began searching the house. I tried to explain what had happened, but my voice was still trembling from the shock of it all. They found nothing. No sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle, nothing that explained how the men had gotten in. I stayed up the rest of the night, too scared to sleep, too terrified of what had almost happened. The police were thorough, but they couldn't find any evidence. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no suspects. I moved out of my house the very next day. The attacks, the knockings, the terror, it all stopped the moment I left. But the feeling of being hunted, of being watched, lingered long after I left. I never really escaped it. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I half expected to see that man standing behind me, just out of sight. Rachel and I never spoke about it again. We both tried to forget it, to move on, but the memory of that night still haunts me. The police couldn't catch the men, and I don't think they ever will. There are nights when I still hear the sound of knocking at my door, loud, insistent, unforgiving. I lie in bed, frozen, knowing that some things never go away. Some things just wait for you to forget, to lower your guard. And when you do, that's when they come back. If you actually enjoyed these stories, please subscribe and leave us a comment to the next horror story you'll want us to tell. Till then, see you in the next one.